Christmas Day 1914, on the Western Front of the First World War. Somewhere between the British and German trenches in Belgium, a German soldier and a British soldier walked out into no man's land, met in the middle of a frozen field, and shook hands. The day before, they would have shot each other on sight. The day after, they would again. But for one day, in the middle of a war that would kill 17 million people, a few 100,000 frightened young men decided, without orders, that they would rather not. This is the story of how one of them got there, and what it cost him to remember it. December 24th, 1914. A trench somewhere south of Ypres, in a field that used to belong to a Belgian dairy farmer. The mud is frozen tonight, which is the first kindness it has shown all month. A 19-year-old from Birmingham, named Henry. He is writing a letter home by the light of a candle stub. He has not told his mother that 2 of the boys he enlisted with are dead. He is trying to think of what to say instead. Before we get into his story, welcome to People and Time, where every episode we follow one ordinary person through one ordinary day, somewhere in history. No battles, no thrones, just life. I'm glad you're here, let's go back. 5 months earlier, Henry had never seen a rifle. He worked in a brass foundry in Birmingham, polishing fittings for ship lamps. He went to the music hall on Saturdays. He had a girl named Eliza who worked in the same foundry and laughed too loud at his jokes. When the recruiting sergeants came through in August, the posters said the war would be over by Christmas. Henry thought that sounded about right. He signed his name with a steady hand. By November, he was in France. He remembered the crossing more than the landing, the way the channel chop made men sick who had never been on a boat before, the way the older soldiers laughed at them, the way he laughed too, because it seemed like the thing to do. He did not feel afraid yet. Afraid came later, in small installments, the way a bill comes due. The first trench Henry saw was not what he had pictured. He had imagined something tidy, something like a road. What he found was a ditch the color of wet ash, with duckboards floating in it like raft wreckage, and a smell he would never describe in his letters home. A sergeant told him to keep his head down and his feet dry. Henry tried to do both. He failed at both. Trench life had a rhythm Henry came to know. Stand to before dawn, every man at the parapet, rifles at the ready, watching for an attack that almost never came. Then breakfast. Bacon if you were lucky, biscuit and jam if you were not. Then work parties, shoring up walls, bailing water, carrying ammunition. Then waiting. The waiting was the part nobody had warned him about. Henry wrote home every Sunday. He never told the truth exactly. He said the food was good. He said the officers were decent. He said he had made friends, which was true. He did not say that one of those friends, a boy from Walsall named Tom, had been killed in November by a bullet that came from nowhere and went nowhere afterward. Henry wrote, "Tell Mother not to worry. We are quite comfortable here." Sometimes, when the wind was right, Henry could hear the Germans in their trench, 80 yards away. He could hear them coughing. He could hear them swearing. Once he heard one of them whistling a tune he half recognized. He thought about it for a long time afterward. He had been told to think of them as monsters. He had been told a lot of things in training that did not survive contact with the actual cold. By mid-December, the cold had become its own enemy. Men's feet rotted inside their boots. The water in canteens froze solid by morning. The grease on the rifles thickened until the bolts would not move. Henry rubbed his hands together until they bled, and then he rubbed them some more, because bleeding hands at least felt like hands. On the night of December 23rd, the shelling stopped. Henry noticed it the way you notice a clock has stopped ticking. There was no announcement, no order. The guns simply went quiet on both sides, as if everyone involved had gotten tired at the same time. The men looked at each other. Nobody knew what it meant. Henry wrote in his letter, "Something is different tonight, Mother. I can't say what." Just before midnight on Christmas Eve, Henry saw the first one. A small light, no bigger than a candle, lifted up above the German parapet. Then another, then another. Within minutes, the whole German line was glowing softly with what looked, impossibly, like little Christmas trees. Henry stared. He thought he might be dreaming. The man next to him, a Welsh corporal named Davies, said, very quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." Then the singing began. A single voice at first, deep, German, slow. Henry did not know the words, but he knew the tune. Still Nacht, silent night. The voice was joined by another, then a dozen, then what sounded like the whole German line, singing into the cold air. When they finished, there was a pause. And then, from somewhere down Henry's own trench, an English voice picked up the same carol in English, and the British line sang it back to them. Henry did not sing. He had a terrible voice, and he knew it. But he listened, and he felt something open up in his chest that he had been holding closed for months. He thought of Eliza, and the music hall, and his mother in the parlor, and the boy from Walsall, who would never sing again. He let the tears come because nobody could see them in the dark. An hour or so later, a German voice called across no man's land in broken English. "English soldier! English soldier! Merry Christmas!" There was a long silence on the British side. Then a sergeant, Henry never learned his name, stood up on the fire step in full view of the enemy line and shouted back, "Merry Christmas, Fritz." "Same to you." And nobody fired. Henry slept maybe 2 hours. He woke at dawn on Christmas morning to find the men around him already awake, peering over the parapet in the pale gray light. The Germans were doing the same. Both sides were watching the strip of frozen ground between them. Nobody had given an order. Nobody knew quite what came next. But everyone, on both sides, seemed to understand that whatever came next, it was not going to be killing. It was a German who went first. A tall man with a heavy mustache climbed out of his trench, alone, and walked 20 paces into no man's land with his hands open and empty. He stopped. He waited. For a long minute, nobody on the British side moved. Then the same sergeant from the night before climbed out and walked toward him, and the two men met in the middle of a frozen field, where the day before, they would have killed each other on sight. Henry climbed out of the trench around mid-morning. He was not brave. He was just curious and tired of being afraid, and the thing that was happening seemed too strange to watch from a distance. He walked slowly across the frozen ground, and a German soldier his own age walked toward him, and they met without saying anything, because neither of them spoke a word of the other's language. The German held out his hand. Henry shook it. They began to trade. Cigarettes for cigars. British rum for German schnapps. Buttons cut from tunics as souvenirs. One British soldier had a tin of plum pudding and gave half of it to a German who had never tasted such a thing and made a face that Henry would remember laughing about for the rest of his life. Henry traded a packet of woodbines for a small wooden carving of a horse. He kept that horse for 61 years. Somebody, somewhere down the line, produced a football. Henry did not see the game itself, but he heard about it for the rest of the day. Germans against British, no proper goals, no proper rules, played in greatcoats on frozen mud. He heard the score afterward. The Germans had won 3-2. He wondered later if that was true, or if the men had just made it up because it was the kind of thing that ought to have happened. In the afternoon, the truce turned to its more solemn purpose. For weeks, both sides had men lying dead in no man's land where it had been suicidal to retrieve them. Now, together, the British and the Germans walked the field and gathered their dead. Henry helped carry a Scottish private back to his own line. A German soldier helped him lift the body. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the act itself did not already say better. Some of the men had cameras. There were photographs taken that day. Germans and British standing arm in arm, smiling for the lens, in the strangest group portraits the war would ever produce. Few of those photographs survive. You can find them in archives. The men in them look like men who can scarcely believe what is happening to them, because none of them could. Henry sat for a while with the German boy he had shaken hands with. They could not talk, so they smoked instead. The German showed Henry a photograph from his pocket. A young woman, dark-haired, smiling. Henry showed him Eliza. They each made noises of approval. They did not need translation for that. After a while, the German said something Henry did not understand and pointed at his own chest and said, "Carl." Henry pointed at himself and said, "Henry." That was the entire conversation. As the light began to fail, the men drifted back to their own lines. There was no signal. They simply began, by some unspoken agreement, to go home. Henry shook Carl's hand again. Carl gave him a small button from his tunic. Henry gave Carl one of his. They did not say goodbye, because neither knew the word in the other's language, and because goodbye was the wrong word for what was happening anyway. That night, no shots were fired. The men sat in their trenches and sang again, sometimes together, sometimes apart. Henry wrote in his letter. He had been writing it now for 2 days. "Mother, the strangest thing has happened. I have shaken hands with a German. He showed me a photograph of his girl. I do not know how to tell you what this day has been. I am not sure I will believe it myself in the morning. Within days, the order came down from the high command on both sides. There would be no more truces. There would be no more fraternization. Officers who had allowed it would be reprimanded. Men who took part would be punished. The generals had decided correctly that armies which made friends with their enemies could not be relied upon to kill them. The war was to resume. And it did. Henry survived the war. Not many of the men who stood in that trench beside him did. He went home to Birmingham in 1919, and he married Eliza, and he went back to the Foundry, and he did not talk about the war very often, the way most of them did not. But he kept the little wooden horse in a drawer beside his bed for 61 years. And he kept Carl's button on a shelf above the fireplace. And every Christmas Eve, until he died in 1975, he would take them down and hold them and say nothing. The Christmas Truce of 1914 has been told and retold for more than a century now. It has been called many things: a miracle, a fluke, a one-day mutiny against a war nobody fully wanted yet. What it was, more simply, was a thing that happened. A few 100,000 frightened young men, from villages and cities they would never see in each other's countries, decided for one day that they would rather not. That is all. That is everything. Henry finished the letter on December 26th. He addressed it to his mother in Birmingham. He sealed it with wax. He gave it to a runner who took it to the field post. And from the field post it traveled to the coast, and across the Channel, and through the railways of England, and arrived eventually at a small terraced house where a woman opened it at her kitchen table and read what her son had written. She kept that letter. Her family still has it. You can read it if you go and ask. The pen, the candle, the little wooden horse. A boy of 19 in a cold field in Belgium on the night the war forgot itself.